Life of Pi was an incredibly difficult film to make. You cannot possibly make a movie out of this story. It's kind of crazy. And then the producer has torn up the script and brought in somebody else to rewrite it. I just happened to meet a certain person at a certain time. You can make a film in any country in Central Asia for $1 million or $2 million. But Ang Lee, to his eternal credit, said, I can make the film. And he did make the film. And he won an Oscar for Best Director. You're competing for people who have smartphones, who want to see video games, and they want to do TikTok, and they want to do all of these kind of things on social media.
Hello, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome Dr. Martin Smith, a specialist in creative economy, a cultural industries policy, a film business professional, a consultant to Ingenious Media. He's also a visiting fellow at the Institute for Creative and Cultural Entrepreneurship at Goldsmiths, University of London. Dr. Smith, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
I'd love to start by hearing about your personal journey. What first drew you into the world of creative economy and filmmaking?
You know, that's a very interesting question, but it has a quite long answer. Most of my life, I've worked in public policy, government type activities. For my day job, if you like. That's how I've earned my living. But I've always been interested in creative things. And for many years, I was involved in the theatre in London. I was the chair of a very famous theatre company called the Young Vic Company. And when I was in that role, I met a man who was big in the entertainment sector. He had worked with Andrew Lloyd Webber, the big maker of musicals, Cats and Phantom of the Opera and these kind of things. And his name was Patrick McKenna, and Patrick and I started to work together about 20 years ago. And he started a company called Ingenious, and Ingenious went on to be very big in the film investment business. So Patrick asked me to work with him on all the regulatory side of things, the government, corporate public relations, this kind of thing. So it was an accident, is the real answer to your question. I just happened to meet a certain person at a certain time, and we worked together in this area, which now we call creative industries.
What are the current trends in the film industry?
You know, one thing is always true in the film business, which is that it is always changing. There is never any period where things stand still. And that can be a good thing and maybe sometimes not a good thing. And you never really quite know which way things are going to change. Because the first thing to say is that film is and always has been a very exciting business, but also a very risky business. So one of the films that I have been associated with, the company I work with has been associated with, for example, is a film called Avatar, which is immensely famous. It's the biggest selling movie of all time. We financed this film in 08, 09, and everybody said, you know, this is going to be the biggest technical and financial flop of all time, you know. And we were quite worried about it because it was immensely expensive, $400 million. But it was a success. And it was a success in 3D. You know? So this was one point I was going to make to you, that sometimes the technology in the industry changes, and it's a success, and sometimes it's not. 3D as a technology was introduced in 1922. The first 3D film, it was called The Power of Love, even before sound. Right? So we've had 3D for 100 years, more than 100 years, and the Avatar was in 3D. But not everybody likes 3D. You have to wear these goggles, these spectacles, and not everybody likes that. But in answer to your question, there is always technological change. And the biggest thing that has changed in the last 10 years is what we call the digital shift. So the consumption of film has moved dramatically away from theatrical release in cinemas, which of course we still have, but far more now is consumed digitally via streaming. First of all, we had downloads, but now we have streaming. Netflix and Disney Plus and all of these companies. So the economics of the business has changed dramatically in the last 10 years. And it's made things very much more difficult in terms of finance. So that's one thing. The second thing, and we have to say this because we still have not recovered from the change, the pandemic, COVID 2021, 22 was a disaster for the film industry because nobody could go to the cinema. All the cinemas were closed. In my country, in the UK, there was a time when cinemas were losing £6 million every day because they were closed completely. And it's been 5 years now, and there has been a substantial recovery in the box office, but it is not a total recovery. In many countries around the world, the cinema audience is still only about 80 or 90% of what it was in 2019 before the pandemic. So this is true in Europe, it's true in the US, it's true in the UK. So we are still recovering from COVID. And I think those are the two big things in answer to your question. You have the changing digital consumption patterns in the industry, and you have the recovery from COVID. So that means that the industry is continuing to change and develop. And I think it means also that there are opportunities developing in places where perhaps the industry has been through difficult times. So what do I mean by that? First of all, I think you can see a trend towards more local storytelling or regional storytelling. In other words, it's not all Hollywood. It's not all kind of big US stuff. It's not all big animation. It's not all big superhero stuff. There is now more of an appetite for stories which are diverse and from different parts of the world. The most interesting example is South Korea, actually. The film industry in South Korea has become extraordinarily successful in the last few years, including winning one Oscar for Best Movie, a film in South Korea, in Korean language. This 20 years ago, this would have been impossible. And I think for countries in Central Asia, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, I think this means that there may well be new opportunities going forward. Why do I say this? I think there are two reasons. Firstly, there is more of an appetite for different stories, stories which tell tales, tell stories from different points of view, different cultures. There is an appetite to discover new things. But secondly, um, this thing about the digital revolution, the digital shift, what this means is that you can make films for much less money than used to be the case. You can make a film in any country in Central Asia for $1 million or $2 million. A good film, right? That same film in my country, in the UK, or in France would probably cost $5 or $6 million. In America, it would cost $10 million, or maybe more. So there's a combination of things here. Firstly, you can make things more cheaply. Secondly, there is an appetite for different kinds of stories. So I think that the future is probably good here for filmmakers, and it's probably due to this combination of changes. Um, and the fact that people are always they always want to see stories. I mean, they always the cinema will always be with us, but it is just now more financially difficult to do because not everybody goes to the cinema anymore. I think this is the biggest challenge, actually. The biggest challenge for filmmakers is that you are competing not just with other cinemas, other films. You're competing with this. You're competing for people who have smartphones, who want to see video games, and they want to do TikTok, and they want to do all of these kind of things on social media. So there is constantly this battle for attention, right? And this is particularly true for young people, right? People of your generation, I use this thing much more than people of my generation. But I do believe, in spite of all of that, I think that there will always be opportunities for good films. And I'm optimistic that in this part of the world, there will be a good future.
What do you think can be done to make cinemas attractive to viewers again?
Well, I think, first of all, certainly in my country, in the UK, things are already changing, uh, by which I mean that the cinemas themselves are changing. It used to be the case that you had maybe 200 seats in a cinema, and you were like this with a row in front. You didn't have very much leg room. Now, cinemas are being made more comfortable. So people like me can stretch their legs. And you maybe have a little table here and you have a drink and some popcorn or whatever. So there are changes being made to the physical layout so that they're more attractive to people who want a leisurely night out. But of course, the biggest issue is what films. I mean, what films are there available to be seen? And, you know, this is quite a complex area because public taste in many countries is changing. And what the result of this is that there are now a few films that are monsters, that are really big, like Barbie, like Top Gun Maverick, like these kind of superhero films. And then the generality of dramatic films, the kind of films that used to appear every week, 5 or 6 or 10 different films, stories about love and war and passion and everyday dramatic stories. Some of these films are now finding it much more difficult to find an audience. Um, so you have this situation in which Barbie is enormous, and some uh, very good but not so well known film is playing to empty cinemas. So, in other words, the nature of the audience, the consumption of film, is changing with these very big films and very small. And so this. I'm explaining this because it makes life difficult for cinemas, because cinemas have to fill their seats in order to compete. So here's an interesting thing. In my country, I don't know whether it's happening here yet, but one new development is what we call event cinema. So this is maybe an opera performance, the performance of something that the Metropolitan Opera in New York or Royal Opera House in Covent Garden, or maybe the performance of a play by William Shakespeare at the Royal National Theatre, or maybe it's a rock concert, right, by uh, any kind of hip hop or ancient, Rolling Stones, even. Rolling Stones still playing concerts. And what is now happening is that some of these events are being filmed and shown in cinemas. Right? So you can go and see an opera, or you can go and see King Lear by Shakespeare in cinemas. And that did not happen 10, 20 years ago. This is a new development. What it means is that the definition of what you can see in cinema is changing. And I think that's a very good thing, because it means that there's more choice and different kinds of attraction to get more people to go back. And that is what we are now all trying to do, to get people to going back. Because, as I said earlier, COVID, people still remember COVID. And some of them are nervous still about being in public places. So the choice available the choice of entertainment is expanding. And that's a good thing for the exhibition sector, what we call the exhibition sector of the cinemas, because if they can't thrive, then cinema is dead.
Working on iconic films like Life of Pi, Avatar, as you said, what film was the most meaningful to you?
Oh, well, I'm very proud of the association with Life of Pi, because Life of Pi was an incredibly difficult film to make. In fact, um, the story, as you know, is what we call magic realism. I mean, it's a very complicated story, and it involves a tiger out at sea. And actually, the story, which is a novel, it was a very successful novel, was offered to 2 or 3 film directors. And the first 2 directors said, no, 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 no. It's completely impossible. You cannot possibly make a movie out of this story. It's kind of crazy, right? And then the brilliant film director, Ang Lee, said, okay, I can do it. Right? And I can do it in 3D. But of course, we're going to have to spend a lot of money, because we can't use a real tiger, right? We can't use a real tiger in a boat. Tigers don't. You can't play around with tigers with young kids. Um, they don't play by the rules. So this has to be a pretend tiger, but it has to be done in such a way that it is totally believable. So this is all done by what we call computer graphics. I mean, it's very advanced technology, which is why the film costs so much money to make. I mean, huge amount of money. But Ang Lee, to his eternal credit, said, I can make the film. And he did make the film. And he won an Oscar for Best Director for that film. So I'm very proud to be associated with that.
What qualities should a screenplay have for you to see its potential for success?
The first thing to say is that a very famous screenwriter, American screenwriter, his name is William Goldman. And he actually wrote a book called Adventures of a Screenwriter. And he once said something which needs to be explained. And what he said was, nobody knows anything. And people say, well, that's a silly thing to say. Of course, somebody knows things. But what he meant when he said nobody knows anything, what he meant was that in the film business, it is impossible to know in advance what is going to be successful and what isn't in terms of a movie or what constitutes a movie. In other words, the box office response. Nobody can predict what the public's response is going to be. And by the way, some immensely famous and very great films have been commercial failures. I mean, that's happened many times, starting with Citizen Kane, one of the most famous films of all time, was not a commercial success. So Goldman says, nobody knows anything, and he means nobody can predict the response. Now, this becomes more interesting when you come to your question, because why is it that some scripts are successful in the sense they are successfully turned into films? And by the way, only about 1 in 10 scripts ever move forward to the development process. And then only about 1 in 10 of those ever go into the production process. I mean, it's a tiny, tiny proportion of scripts ever end up being made into a film. And I think it's a combination of a storyline which has the capability of grabbing the interest of the audience. But most of all, I think it's dialogue. It's the dialogue that takes place between the leading characters. But the real answer to your question is that however much you analyze this, I mean, you could put a script in front of me now and I could say, these are my comments. And then you could put a script in the same script in front of this person and that person. So 3 of us, perhaps, all in the business, all knowing something. And we might well have different views. We might have different views. I mean, in the Hollywood system, famously, people have started working on films. They've started working on scripts, and then the producer has torn up the script and brought in somebody else to rewrite it. And people get very angry when that happens. What's wrong with and I don't think, therefore, there is a definitive answer to your question. There is no perfect way of judging a script. Yes, you can tell a bad script from a good script, but a good script from a very good script from a very, very good script, these are difficult judgments to make. And in the end, um, it is also true that some films with very good scripts are not in the end commercially successful, and some films with not very good scripts become huge. You know, there is no strict correlation between the quality of the script and how well the film performs. So it's an area of some subjectivity, I would say. But in the end, it's experience, the experience of knowing what is likely to work. Um, and fortunately, those are not decisions I have to make.
What is the appeal of long-term investments in art and cinema?
The first thing to say is that there are many different kinds of investment and many different kinds of investor. Let's just talk about film. I mean, if we talk about all the other art forms, it gets more difficult. There are many, many, many different kinds of investor. I have just had, not long ago, had the experience and great pleasure of going to see an old filmmaker, a Kyrgyz man, who is in his 60s. And he'd been making films since the 1980s. So he starts with the Soviet system, and actually this man has his own film museum in a place called Kuntu, just outside Bishkek. And I went to see him there. And he's in his 60s. He's still making films. And they are based on Kyrgyz fairies, not fairy tales, but myths and legends. And he told me that his last film was financed by two international trusts, foundations, charitable foundations, one from Japan and one from Switzerland. Now, the budget was about $1 million. So he financed this film, which is a cultural film. It is a deep cinematic exploration of part of Kyrgyz tradition, nomadic tradition, of course, but it was financed by charitable, philanthropic money, not commercial money, not banks, not any of these people. So that's one kind of investor. I would call that is cultural investment, really, and it's international in nature. That is a million miles away from the Hollywood system. I mean, Disney, for example, Disney always has completely financed all its own films. By the way, that's different from the other studios. So Universal and MGM and all these other companies, they spread the financial risk. But the reality is that, particularly in Europe and also in the UK, you have two very different kinds of financial investment. One is public sector, it's government money, either directly or through a film institute. In our case, the British Film Institute, but in France, the CNC. All European countries have these institutes, or through state broadcasting companies. So the traditional film model in Europe, in particular, has been very based on the role that state finance plays through television production, and through film institutes. And private sector money has played a relatively small role, and that is still true, by the way. In the UK, private sector money plays a bigger role. But what I'm saying and trying to explain is that there is not one kind of investor. There are many different kinds of investor, and there are commercial investors classically in the US tradition. The Americans have always regarded film business as business. That's very important to understand, as entertainment business, for 100 years, and they're very aggressive in that way. The Europeans have always much more focused on public culture, the cultural aspects, and have supported their industries through tax and through the television broadcast system, as I explained. So there are different models around the world. I mean, radically different models. Uh, the system in China is a combination of state money and private money, but the private money does what the state tells it to. So it's still state control. So you have these very, very, very different traditions. It's interesting to me to see how things will develop here in this part of the world, because I've met young directors, I've met young Kyrgyz directors, I've met young Kazakh directors who are succeeding in raising funds to make their films, relatively small budgets, 2, 3 million maybe. And they're doing it not through the state, they're doing it through private investors, through what we call high net worth individuals, people with money who want to invest in film. All of these models are developing, and I think there will be the most interesting thing is now how you finance film in the digital age, because the one thing that has radically changed is the financing model. Paying for films on through digital streaming does not deliver revenues in the same way that the physical box office did in cinema. People may pay $1, $2 to see a film on a streaming system, whereas they would have paid $6 or $7 in the cinema. Now, how this works in Central Asia, in the Central Asian market, I don't know. But I think that the future is actually likely to involve more private money and less public money, I would think. Because the taxpayer at the moment is spending almost too much. They're providing too much of the income in European countries. We have to find different ways, different models, more private sector models.
What are some common financial mistakes that young filmmakers tend to make?
Spend too much money. That is a serious answer, actually. That one has to admit that it's now very difficult. It's very difficult now to finance, particularly what I'd call independent films. It's much harder to find the money than 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So how do you respond to this? You have to respond by keeping your costs as low as possible. And you can do this partly because digital equipment is much cheaper than the equipment that used to be used in the days of real film, before digitalization. But it's all the other costs. It's location costs, and it's the cost of talent. One of the reasons why filmmaking in America is in some kind of crisis now, because everybody's very expensive.
Yeah.
Making films in California is horribly expensive because there is a high level of regulation, and because actors want to be paid a lot of money, directors want to be paid a lot of money. So I would say, I mean, particularly looking at the world from Turkmenistan or Central Asia, you have to keep your costs as low as possible. And it's easier for you to do that because it's not likely that you're going to hire Tom Cruise to make a movie and he will start at $5 million. So there we go. You have to keep all of your costs, your talent costs, your technical costs, your all of the other costs as low as possible until you are sure that you can distribute your film in a commercial way to make enough money to then be able to spend more for the next film.
Mhm.
You should work on the assumption that you keep your costs low in order to make it more possible for you to break even, preferably make a small profit. Then when you've learned how to do that, maybe you can spend some more money. But it's all about keeping costs low, I would say. If you don't do that and you haven't covered your costs, you're going to go bankrupt. And that's not a happy experience.
What advice would you give to producers when searching for funding?
I think you have to start by acknowledging that the financial models for making films do vary enormously from country to country. The tradition of financing films is very different in Europe from America, India, China. And so when you ask the question, what advice? I'd have to start by saying it depends which country you are working in, because it is radically different.
How can Central Asian filmmakers effectively present their projects to international funds?
I think you probably should begin with Central Asian festivals because it's easier to attract international interest from producers, distributors, sales agents at festivals within the region. For example, there is a relatively new, I think there have been two film festivals in Almaty in Kazakhstan, organized by a lady called Helene Howard. She invites global producers, distributors from Europe and North America to come to Almaty to see the work of Central Asian filmmakers from Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan. And I think that's an easier way to present your work. It doesn't mean having to fly to Cannes or Venice or Toronto. Of course, what you want to do when you have made your film and you want to develop interest in it, understandably you want to submit it to Cannes and you want to submit it to Venice and Toronto and all of the other big festivals. But it's easier to start with the smaller festivals, I think. And it's interesting to me that there are Central Asian filmmakers who have um, shown their work in in many European festivals. Locarno, for example, has shown the work of many Central Asian filmmakers. So it's not something which it's impossible to do, but it's probably easier to start within the continent first and then meet people, make connections, and then work outwards to try to build on those connections and get invitations to other festivals. But it's not an easy thing to do. But as I said earlier, I think what is hopeful and promising about the way the market is developing is that there is this appetite to see something different, um, an appetite around the world to see stories, even with subtitles. I mean, it used to be the case, 10 years ago in my country, nobody watched films with subtitles. It was regarded as a distraction, or they may have watched, famous French films by Godard or famous directors, but on the whole, people didn't like subtitles. And this changed. It changed partly because Scandinavian noir became very popular. Thriller stories, murder stories, which were shot in Denmark and Sweden, and they all had subtitles, and they became quite popular in the UK. And now, there is more of an appetite to see stories from other countries. As I say, the most extraordinary example of success is this South Korean, the South Korean miracle. In South Korean, it's called Hallyu, which means the wave. There's the wave of interest in the culture, the movies, the theater, the music of South Korea has become a sort of wave. And I think if that can happen, then it can happen to culture from any country.
Dr. Smith, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. Your thoughts on filmmaking were truly inspiring. We look forward to seeing the continued impact of your work. Until next time.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure talking to you.